Story 1. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. I needed the money, so I endured it. Then the supervisor began requiring 4 to 6 hours of overtime almost every day. I physically could not do it. That made me quit. Story 2. I was a dishwasher at a Chinese restaurant. Then they asked me to prepare food. Later, they asked me to cook. Eventually, I had to cook, prepare, and wash dishes at the same time with no help. The manager and the other cook never assisted me, even though I was busy. They would stand around talking for 20 minutes while I worked. They could have helped me but chose not to. My manager would teach me how to do something for about 10 seconds, say easy, and then walk away, even though I had never done that before. One day, I woke up frustrated and did not show up again. Story 3. I have been the one who keeps microwaving fish in the office kitchen. I was caught after 2 years, so I had to quit before I got fired. Story 4. They wanted me to be in charge of job sites but only wanted to pay $14 an hour. So I said no and quit on the spot. Story 5. A long time ago, I worked at a company that rhymes with Home Depot. It was the worst experience I have ever had. I had to travel halfway across the state to attend cashier college, where they taught us things that anyone could teach on the job. Then I started my cashier position and discovered that they only trusted one person on the entire floor to override any correction at checkout. There could often be many corrections in any large transaction in an area the size of a Home Depot. So my average day would be attempt to check out a person. Oops, they wanted something different or wanted to change something. Call for a manager to approve it. Wait several minutes. The customer would get increasingly agitated. Wait some more. Wait some more. Wait some more. The customer is now more agitated and taking it out on me. Wait some more. Wait some more. Wait some more. The customer is now livid. Wait some more. Oh, see a manager in the distance. Wait some more. Suffice it to say, I lasted about 3 weeks there and did not even formally quit. I just stopped going, and that is the only place I have ever done that. It was the worst job I have had in my entire life. Story 6. I was teaching in a 2-year-old classroom. As summer approached, the supervisor was struggling to find someone willing to teach the school-age children. I was asked to do this on the condition that I would have a consistent start and leave time, rather than a changing weekly schedule. The first week I was with the school-age children, my supervisor was on vacation, and no one else was aware that my schedule was supposed to change. I gave them the benefit of the doubt and was flexible about when I arrived and left. The next week, she acted upset when I reminded her about the arrangement we had made. Rather than continue the frustrating conversation, I made a pithy remark, something like, "Well, I guess we'll just figure it out without you as usual," and went back to my children. She came to the door of my classroom, which was really a temporary space with the bare minimum set up for the summer, and yelled at me. She said that if I didn't like how she ran the school, I could leave. Then she walked away. My director heard this and offered to cover for me while I collected myself. I accepted the offer but decided to gather my things and leave quietly through the back. Story 7. I worked at Petco when I was getting back on my feet after my divorce. A new manager came into the pet store with a marketing degree, wanting us to envision our animals less as animals and more as products that needed to be sold as quickly as possible. For example, aquarium fish were not to be treated with proper care but were to be sold by color. She wanted all of the orange fish in the same tank. Swordfish, goldfish, betta fish, and cichlids. That was a disaster, not just because 2 of those fish are meat eaters but because all 4 of those fish live in different kinds of water. I couldn't explain to her that you had to keep male and female mice apart, and that you couldn't bag feeder mice in little plastic bags for self-service for people who wanted live mice to feed their animals that required live food. If you put a live animal in a plastic bag, it soon became a dead animal or would bite its way out and become a loose animal. Loose mice running around a store would cause us to lose our license and also really gross people out. She didn't like it when we fed live mice to our reptiles, so she wanted us to wean them off live mice and feed them frozen mice, which they didn't like. Her rule was that we had to come in early and prepackage crickets in plastic bags, which happened the same way as live mice. By midday, we were throwing dead crickets in the trash. That was frustrating for bookkeeping. She was opposed to taking time out of the day to interact with the animals, which makes them easier to sell to customers. You have to handle animals like birds, guinea pigs, and snakes to get them used to being handled. It's called training. She didn't understand this because, although she worked in a pet store, she herself didn't have pets. She decided to take over ordering the fish and reptile sections based not on what needed replacing from my carefully kept records, but on what corporate told her was going to be on sale in 2 weeks. I was a customer who drove animals to doctor's appointments for an employee discount to the pet manager. I handed in my keys after she refused to learn water quality testing and tossed all my testing equipment and medications. Summary: I worked at Petco. They are not pet people. Story 8. An alcoholic supervisor called me a liar in front of customers, even though I was completely in the right. Story 9. I got overworked because I was in management. I spoke up for myself, but my manager started to bully me. I took it up with the general manager, and he defended her without letting me explain my side. They made me sign a write-up and I walked out. Story 10. I realized I had more job security than I thought since they were not even looking for a second person in maintenance. Eventually, I got so tired of tasks like wrestling the giant trash bags that had been sitting there unchanged for 2 days straight, with the lid put back on like a little hat and getting yelled at for spending too much time on them. I wondered what would happen if I just left and saw the people I dislike struggle to fill the void. Their plan for the first 3 months after I quit was to ask me to come back. Also, the person I disliked only lasted about a week as my impromptu replacement. Story 11. I was tired of not even making it paycheck to paycheck and begging for raises while working hard for them. I took the severance package and left. Also, there is always that one coworker who makes work just like living in hell. I feel better now that I am not living paycheck to paycheck. Story 12. Working at McDonald's about 10 years ago, there is a process when you swap from breakfast to lunch to make sure all lunch foods are ready to go at exactly 10:30 a.m. I was told by my manager to go on break right before that process, and instead, 2 new employees handled it. I came back from break and nothing had been done. Lunch orders were coming in, but no lunch had been made. Breakfast foods were still out and it was a mess. The next day, the regional manager came and was very upset about how the changeover went the day before. Everyone was written up. I explained that I was sent on break and had nothing to do with it, so I did not want to sign the write-up. They replied that it was a team effort. I did not sign the write-up. The following day, they did not fire me, but they removed my hours from the schedule. When I found out, I walked off the job. Story 13. A coworker was buying drugs in the parking lot and then using them in the bathroom. I reported this to the district manager with photo evidence, but the coworker was not fired. I left after that. Story 14. I had a breakdown and burnout. When I went back to work, one of my coworkers was hostile towards me. I did not want to fight, so I just quit. Story 15. At least 5 messages per hour on my days off and on. Look, if you do not know how to run your ship, I do not need to be here to do it for you. Story 16. Having my employment threatened for being 37 seconds late to work, followed by being called a dog multiple times as my boss told company security to put a leash on me and fire me as soon as I slip up because I added time back on my card after catching my boss secretly trying to reduce my worked hours prior to working them. Daniel Tucker is a great misogynistic, racist, abusive, and immoral person. Story 17. When a client asked if I offered a stepdaughter experience and then paid extra for me to cry during the session, I realized I needed a new line of work and several rounds of therapy. Story 18. Late night closing shift at a fast food restaurant. The policy is to close the doors on time. On this night, someone came up to the door just as I was locking up, and the manager insisted I let them in. Okay, fine. I was on cleanup duty anyway, so it was no big deal. She told me to go to the counter and help out. I asked her what she needed. She started yelling at me for no reason. I literally could not understand what she wanted. I asked again and she kept yelling. I was fed up, so I clocked out, left my uniform in the office, took my things and just left. The next day, the general manager called me and asked what happened. When I explained, he asked if I would come back to work. I agreed to return but started applying for other jobs immediately and left within a few weeks. Story 19. I am currently in the middle of my 2 weeks notice. We have a new manager, and she is terrible. She has no knowledge of the job and still manages to act like a know-it-all. My giving notice started a chain reaction that led to everyone in my department handing in theirs. Upper management is in shambles now. Decades of knowledge and experience are walking out the door. The job is really hard and does not pay well, but as someone before me said, it is always management. Story 20. 90% of the time, it is always toxic management. Even if it is not your direct supervisor, it is related to management. Story 21. I hated taking advantage of people who knew very little about what they were signing up for or buying, so I quit. Story 22. Cross-training or performing more tasks than the job description entails. Low pay rate, strict supervision such as excessive monitoring, unprofessionalism, and disorganization. Story 23. My boss accused me of throwing things around the kitchen when I was just moving faster. Over a year of discrimination due to my gender and disability snapped at that moment, and I quit my next shift. Story 24. Flippant threats of being fired despite having no idea how to do my job led to a breaking point, and I resigned. This was one of many instances of chronic verbal abuse. I have a better situation now where my skill set is truly appreciated. I still work in the same building as before. It is satisfying to see them fail due to their own mistakes. I am not the only person subjected to abuse. Human Resources is investigating now. Story 25. Got into 2 accidents in 2 days. Neither was my fault. I got hit from behind, and then the next day a tree branch fell onto the top of the work truck. I spent more time going to the police station twice and the clinic for a drug test twice. The following week, twice, the Attorney General Department came to pay me a visit. Obviously, this office sent them. I said no more. Story 26. There is a tone I will not accept. Everyone gets to use it once. After that, they never see me again. It is frustrating. I almost died twice for that job and would have continued working myself to exhaustion, but they finally treated me poorly. I saw them treat others that way, but they always knew better than to direct it at me because I was a load-bearing manager. A few months later, I had to testify against them in court. Story 27. The difficulties we had to endure during the COVID-19 pandemic as retail employees were significant. I worked in a liquor store in British Columbia. We were referred to as auxiliary, but if you declined more than 3 shifts, you were terminated. It was very challenging. We were on call with lineups outside to enter the store. Extra sanitizing was required, and there was double the incoming stock. The same number of staff had to handle 5 times the volume of customers. The night before I resigned, I wrote a formal letter of resignation. It was the best day of my life when I said goodbye. Story 28. Was hired to build heating, ventilation, and air conditioning simulators, but ended up wiring countless boards and systems unrelated to heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, constantly being pulled off one job to complete someone else's work, only to be cited for not being efficient in the quarterly reviews. The meticulous grading on projects was even worse. A smudge, fingerprint, bad parts, or silk screens would cause a red card along with plenty of paperwork to fill out. Story 29. The boss had a meeting with the 4 of us who were doing a job I was not actually part of, but I helped them because they were understaffed and falling behind even with my assistance. After he finished reprimanding us for falling behind and supposedly putting a $1 million contract at risk, I offered to join that team full-time as a solution. He said, "No, and if you think this is hard now, wait for the Christmas rush in 2 weeks." I decided that I did not want to stay for that. I got a new job and quit at the end of the week. Story 30. Mental health. Great job, but sadly not taking care of my mental health made me quit. Thankfully, now I take care of it as my #1 priority. Story 31. I had my first job at 15 in a fabric store. This was right before Halloween. At the time, I was very interested in paganism and Wicca. My boss was an extremely religious Christian, and the whole time I worked there, she constantly expressed her hatred for Halloween. She said it was the devil's holiday and that all the people coming in for fabric for costumes were going to burn in hell. I was terrified of her and quit right after Halloween. Story 32. Doing the job of 3 to 4 people and hardly getting paid for one person. The office had me under a lot of pressure some days over the radio, which even some of my coworkers noticed. Not to mention the things I had to clean up from the night shift, either due to lack of knowledge or care, and reporting it to management without any action taken. I eventually stopped putting in even 70% effort. Story 33. The supervisor who never came to the shop tried to manage operations at our 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. shop by telephone and slept until 3 p.m. daily. He did not want us to make decisions on our own. Story 34. Misalignment of values. I wanted to make quality products, and they only wanted to grow their company. Story 35. The company was bought by an Indian company that wanted to gain a foothold in Europe. However, they did this by dismantling and changing everything we were to the point where even our name was changed. All business was also funneled to India. Interestingly, the company already had a subsidiary in Europe, so now we were competing with ourselves. Almost all European employees left a few years after the acquisition. Story 36. An unprofessional owner caused many people to leave his business. Even his own brother and business partner could not continue working with him. Story 37. My previous job? Among other reasons, it was negatively affecting my mental health, so I submitted my 2 weeks' notice. I had been there for at least 12 years by the time I left. Story 38. Oh my God. I worked in cosmetics. The cosmetics manager left suddenly, and the store manager asked me if I wanted extra hours next week. I said sure, and then the cosmetics manager never came back, so I was stuck in the position. I did not know how to do many of the tasks I was expected to do. The store manager got mad at me but did not teach me anything. Eventually, I started learning what to do and improved. I asked for a raise because I should not be running a department while making minimum wage. I had a meeting with the store manager, where she complained about me the whole time and said, "I do not know why you want more money." I received a temporary $2 raise. From that point forward, I was under a microscope. Every mistake I made my life harder. I went on stress leave and came back months later for a couple of weeks before quitting for good. Story 39. Enforcing regular visits to the office in a post-COVID era when it was a 1.5-hour commute. A marketing employee was somehow my boss in an industry she had never worked in before and was inherently difficult. The hierarchy also sold numbers to partners that were fake and unachievable, putting immense and unnecessary stress on me and my colleagues. I have been in this industry for my whole career, 10 years, with a lot of success, and this was the only time I quit. I probably only stayed there for 4 months. Story 40. Working with a manager who I could see was positioning me to be the scapegoat for why our new team was not making money. He belittled my suggestions and feedback, which was ironic when we received a cease and desist during my notice period. I had warned against the exact issue he was causing and was told I did not understand the team vision. Senior management decided to cancel the team a couple of months later after I submitted my resignation. Story 41. I quit a side job working on government-regulated training material. The business refused to fix errors that made the material non-compliant. Managers allowed their egos to get involved and were more concerned about spinning the narrative to upper management than actually doing the hard work of fixing it. Their product has been a failure since. I even saw they are using the work I did as examples for marketing purposes because I am sure they have not produced anything of their own. It was very frustrating, and to this day the project bugs me. Story 42. Announced I would be moved from first to third shift a month into the job for more focused training with no pay change. Now, Story 43. I was a mental health specialist. I worked from an office. A new company bought the place where I worked, and I lost my office. Then they wanted me to meet clients at their homes or, if they were children, at their schools using my personal vehicle. I was also expected to do paperwork for the insurance at my house off the clock, so I was not paid for that time. Additionally, I was not a counselor. I had a bachelor's degree and about 6 months of experience. They were sending me to people I was neither educated nor trained to work with. I could not legally create a treatment plan, and they did not provide me with one. Sometimes I would not even know the mental health issue until I met the client. I quit after a week. I stopped working in mental health after that, which was disappointing because I really enjoyed working there under the original owners. I mostly worked with children with behavioral issues with clear guidance from the doctor. It was very fulfilling work at the time. Story 44. Performance review. Developed internal applications that saved the company a significant amount of money and resulted in a reduction of staff due to cost savings. Received a performance rating of good and subsequently increased my salary by 50%. Story 45. 8 years. Left due to micromanagement and calls after work hours and on days off. Nothing is more tiring than receiving a call on Sunday at 7 p.m. about something I can easily fix on Monday morning. Story 46. I felt like I was in a zombie movie. Everyone was dead on autopilot, miserable, always complaining, with no ambition to improve. The conversation was always about how they believed they should be paid more and how they were afraid of retrenchments. I thought that if I stayed there, I could kiss my ambition and drive goodbye. Sooner or later, I would become one of them, and I could not let that happen. The environment was not good for me. Story 47. Children and parents are not fulfilling their responsibilities in raising children. I was a teacher for 5 years before finally leaving the profession. Story 48. My employer asked me to engineer a system 2 weeks ago. I spent 2 hours working on it and found a solution. He agreed, so I ordered parts for more than 100 copies. 2 days later, he changed his mind and spent 3 days with 3 other people to re-engineer my prototype. They settled on the exact same solution I had developed. Last Thursday was my last day. I am going to enjoy the peacefulness of unemployment for a little while and then move on. Story 49. A few years ago, the owner was being very aggressive with me for no reason. He told me a client said I had been rude to them, which was impossible because I am friendly. I asked for more information, but the owner refused to speak. I said, "If you don't want me to make the same supposed mistake, I need to know what it was." He lunged over his desk at me and shouted in my face, "I am not answerable to you." I decided to leave, went home, and never returned. Story 50. They told me Friday afternoon that they were cutting my pay by 32% retroactive to Monday. I was young and did not know it was illegal. This was a month after informing me that I would not receive reimbursement for the class and certification they wanted unless I worked for 5 years, even though they never mentioned that condition when presenting the option. Story 51. Corporate software developer and consultant. One day, my colleague's heart gave out while he was doing some development at 3 a.m. It was not even a crunch. It was just how he chose to work. I thought, this is not right. Story 52. Being paid so poorly for a job that required a degree and a lot of responsibility while a shop worker earned more for 3 years. Story 53. During the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, when schools started to close, the pizza place where I worked part-time thought it was a good idea to offer free meals for children. I told them I was done and did not show up for that shift. Story 54. 2 things. I needed something that made more money. That was the biggest factor, but also, the job was making me miserable and stressing me out every day I was there. When you come home angry and moody most days, you know it is time for a change. Story 55. First day working at a new nursing home. The registered nurse in charge was setting me up on a buddy shift with an experienced staff member. Every single grumpy middle-aged nurse said they would not work with me, that I would slow them down, and asked to buddy me with someone else while I sat there. I gave the job 2 weeks and resigned on the spot. Story 56. Around 3 a.m., a fantail bird flew into my graveyard shift at the warehouse. Turns out my dad died. I could have easily worked there for a decade, but I quit the next day. Life is too short to die on the inside. It is our job to keep that inner spark alive. Story 57. Baby was born on a Sunday. My boss called on Monday asking if I would be working on Tuesday. Thank goodness we did not depend on my job for insurance. Story 58. Hostile work environment, especially with managers using employees as their personal verbal punching bags simply because they can. Story 59. I worked for a company for 23 years and was mostly happy the whole time. It was a small marketing business with annual sales of about 10 million when I started in 1998 and was around 250 million in annual sales 23 years later. I started working there as an order selector, and by the end, I was running the corporate headquarters warehouse and oversaw all of our remote warehouse locations. However, I knew it would not last forever. There was no succession plan for ownership. One of the owners passed away in 2019. Inevitably, the remaining owner and board sold the company in 2022. I worked for the new ownership group for about 2 years and eventually had to quit. They were completely incompetent and gutted the company that I loved. After the first year and many cuts, they fired about 125 people, many who I had worked with for a decade or longer, over an email on a random Friday. That was it for me. They wanted me to stay. I told them to stop and went to work for a small, family-owned production business. I run their production plant. I make the same money I did before, closer to home, and have a Monday through Friday schedule with ample opportunity for overtime. It can be stressful at times, for sure, but I am happy again. Story 60. Officially, they made me choose between taking 2 more weeks to care for my temporarily incapacitated boyfriend and my job. Unofficially, they made me choose between caring for my temporarily incapacitated boyfriend and my job. Our newly appointed team lead was, and still is, terrible at his job. I was tired of the abuse from our customers and coworkers who thought I was faking my disability because I was suddenly having more good days than bad. Story 61. They wrote me a letter offering me a one-time payment to not come back because they felt I was taking too long to recover from cancer treatment. I quit and sued them. Story 62. Ethics. The chief financial officer told me and my colleague we needed to start upselling our clients more. This was a clinic providing treatment for children with severe developmental disabilities. The upsell he was referring to involved placing them in services they did not need clinically, claiming the children, who were between ages 3 and 5 and mostly nonverbal, requested them, and then billing their parents' insurance. For instance, if a child came in for speech therapy, he wanted us to send them to occupational therapy as well, whether they needed it or not, so he could bill for 2 services simultaneously. When we, the actual practitioners, told him that was unethical, he became angry and told us to do it anyway or be fired. We responded by quitting on the spot. The clinic was shut down a few months later. Story 63. They gave me a hard time because I mistakenly discussed future ambitions, but once I got close to the end of my contract, everything was going great. I had independence and a lot of authority. I could literally schedule a 2-week work trip anywhere on private air travel with no questions asked. It was a fun and unique experience. Once I submitted the documentation to extend my contract, their true colors reemerged. They did not realize the extension did not take immediate effect, and I took advantage of that. I received weeks of phone calls, backtracking, and negotiations, but I was comfortably in my phase of waiting for the contract to expire. The previous chief executive officer gave me a nice parting gift, and we stayed in contact. Story 64. I am purpose-oriented, and they had me parked at a desk with nothing to do just to avoid having me hired by a competitor. It was insane to get paid a lot of money and then walk back to the train, passing by many homeless people. When it became clear that my wife and I were not going to have a baby, I walked away. The only reason I could afford to do this was that my housing expenses are frozen at 2008 levels. We are now barely scraping by with my drastic pay reduction, but on the other hand, no more panic attacks. There are many people falling through the cracks of society. These cracks are no longer small but are occurring quietly. Story 65. Bad management, too little clearance, having to rely on coworkers for tasks I should have clearance for. Did I mention clearance? How can supposed information technology companies mess up account management? I would have done it myself, but alas. Story 66. I worked to reduce a 3-person department to a 1-person department over 16 years, while the owner's nephew started at a higher salary. I was also working another full-time job, 72 hours a week, for 3 years before I decided to choose the other job. Story 67. There was a woman above me but below my boss. She wasn't really a manager but was friendly with the boss, which gave her authority. This job had daily deadlines. We helped each other out. One day, she delegated work for an upcoming deadline for her account. Once the work was spread out, she went outside for a smoke break and left us to do the work. This was the final straw. I called my then husband and asked him what it would take to put me on his health insurance. A little while later, he called me and told me to do it. I walked into my manager's office and put in my 2 weeks' notice. Story 68. I miscalculated my tax bracket and ended up paying far more tax than I should have. I did not get paid for 2 months, which caused me to have severe panic attacks daily. I will never do holiday temporary work for Tesco again. Story 69. Walmart deli manager named Rodney wanted me to close for him one night. He did not even know how to clean the deep fryer. He yelled at me and I walked out. I had already put in my 2 weeks' notice, and that night was my second to last shift. I left. I have no idea if the deep fryer was cleaned that night. I am a people pleaser, so that was probably the meanest thing I have done at work. Story 70. My then boss pulled our small team in for a meeting at the end of a long, brutal season. I had just worked 56 days with only 2 days off and no overtime pay, including 10 days in a row pulling 5 a.m. to 8 p.m. shifts with no breaks. He sat us down and said in plain words, "Do not expect to get a rest over winter. There will be no extra weekends off, and there will be no pay raises next season. So if that does not appeal to you, you know where the door is." I think he was trying to drive away the old woman I had been struggling to work with all season. It was just me and her dealing with close to 150 horses on our own, and she could barely walk faster than a shuffle, so I did all the legwork and all the heavy lifting. After the meeting, I walked outside, and all I could think about was that it was over. I decided then and there I did not want to renew my contract, which was due to expire in a month's time. I thought about it for a couple of weeks, but I only became more certain. I had no other job lined up and nowhere to live because I had been living in farm accommodation. But I quit and decided to figure it out as best I could. Fast forward a year, and I have a great new job that I love, with bosses who are very good to me. I have a nice house to live in, I am getting paid fairly for my time, and I get every weekend and public holiday off. I also had the time and energy to respond to a direct message someone sent me here on Reddit and discovered she is the love of my life. Quitting my job was the best thing I have ever done. Story 71. I was a wine and spirit sales representative for a company that had the largest customer base in my state at the time. It was good money, relatively easy, and really only a 4-day workweek. I was also an alcoholic, and I knew I would never be able to enter recovery while working in that industry. Story 72. I was already getting burnt out, and then I got a new district manager. We did not get along. She was very strict with the rules. I had asked for Monday to Friday day shifts, but she only scheduled me for swing and weekend shifts. I was very frustrated. Story 73. I was covering 3 different positions in 3 different departments and was granted Employee of the Month nationwide. A week later, while covering one of those positions, they changed my schedule unexpectedly, which was supposed to remain constant for another 2 months, in the middle of the week. I told them I had already made plans and needed 1 day off. I had still worked 72 hours that week. They told me it was no problem and to take the day off. However, when I returned, I saw they had charged me sick time for that day. That was the final straw after many other issues. Story 74. I stepped down from my management role, and someone came in to take over. I then interviewed for a lower role to keep while I went back to study, but I was told I wasn't good enough by the new manager, who was now doing the job I had recently left. They left the common use Mac open, and their interview notes were visible, criticizing me and mentioning that they had someone lined up who had been sent all the interview questions to prepare before the actual interview. It is no coincidence that 3 others followed me after I left. A 23-year-old with no management experience should not be put in charge of people, customers, supply, and business. Story 75. This happened at my very first job. Just 3 months in, a client from another country specifically requested me to be on site. The department head shut it down, saying, "It is not safe to send a young woman abroad alone." A few months later, the project manager pushed for it again. Everything was aligned, logistics, approvals, even the business unit head was on board. But during an online meeting, while sitting right across from me, the department head said, "I cannot send her. She has not even completed a year yet." I resigned the very next day with no backup plan, just my self-respect. From what I later heard, the project derailed and was eventually put on hold for at least 6 months. Story 76. I haven't quit yet, but I will after I receive a new job offer. My current workplace is terrible in general. I have spent 5 years stuck at minimum wage because, according to my boss, I don't even deserve the minimum wage I am getting and should be thankful I get paid at all. I am forced to stay and work unpaid overtime. Unpaid because my boss says he doesn't want me to work overtime, and if I have to, it is my fault. I have been assigned many varying roles that should normally be given to at least 3 people. Graphic artist, multimedia artist, production artist, procurement officer, office worker, carpenter, karaoke equipment manager, photographer. Yet my boss isn't satisfied and wants me to do more. Both my boss and his wife are unpleasant in general, often mocking me for my suffering, which they caused. For example, I had to walk to the office for 3 days and skip lunch, and they made fun of me. They even tried to prevent me from attending my grandfather's funeral and later cracked jokes at my grandmother's funeral when I was filing for leave. So much for being religious. Their explanations of tasks often do not make sense, either because they do not know the words but insist they do, or because they expect me to know things only they know. They often berate or insult me for asking questions. In addition to that, they now withhold my salary whenever they are not satisfied with my performance. How do they expect me to do better when I am tired, hungry, and frustrated from taking a 1-hour walk to the office every day? I am now forced to take more loans just to support my family. The president at one point made physical threats to me when all I did was ask a question. He also threatened to go after the restaurant staff's families if they caused a food poisoning incident. They seem to have noticed that I am looking for other work and announced changes regarding leave policies. We now have to submit our leave form 1 month before our absence. That is probably why they are withholding my salary. They may think I was attending a job interview last Tuesday, when I was actually at my cousin's 18th birthday. Since I have become such a vital part of this company, they have resorted to holding my salary hostage. Unfortunately, none of the companies I have applied to wanted to wait for me to resign and render my notice first. So, I am stuck with this situation until I find a new job. I really do not want to risk being unable to pay my loans. Story 77. Based on my recent experience, I realized I was constantly stressed about a job I would not even miss if it disappeared tomorrow because I feel like peace should be my priority. Story 78. Head office management for the home was incompetent. The goals set were unrealistic, the staff were not given the support they needed, and the pressure on day-to-day management was unreasonable. However, the team managed well daily. I left, and my maintenance replacement was so ineffective that they asked me and my predecessor to return, but for the same pay. This was despite other roles in the group receiving pay increases. I did not return and instead earned money driving a minibus. Story 79. I have a mental illness called borderline personality disorder. I have had many jobs. I get overwhelmed with either anger or anxiety. I am male. In females, it is often sadness and anxiety. Sometimes I react impulsively, such as overturning a table or walking away suddenly. It is a work in progress. Story 80. I worked for a large corporate coffee company. The new policies, which were supposed to benefit both employees and customers, ended up upsetting many customers to the point that I was being yelled at daily. We also received a brand new automatic coffee maker intended to make our lives easier, but it broke within the first week. I found out this was a widespread problem. Story 81. Deteriorating physical and mental health due to prolonged stress went unnoticed until I was hospitalized for suicidal ideation from lack of sleep. Being passed over for a promotion 3 years in a row and receiving a 25-cent raise told me that no matter how much I stressed myself by going above and beyond, they did not value me or what I was contributing. I left for a job that offered me $12,000 more a year, and in the last 2.5 years, I have been making $24,000 more. I have lost 40 pounds, and all my lab work associated with it has returned to normal ranges. I have always struggled with my mental health for years, but my job is no longer one of the things making it worse. Story 82. A coworker was harassing me by constantly calling me dumb and stupid, and several customers complained to the manager after overhearing him. Despite the complaints, they scheduled me to work every shift with him. When my uncle died, I became tired of the situation and quit a few months later. I honestly should have quit sooner because I did not like how they treated me. They never allowed me time off for college classes, even though they knew I was in college before they hired me. Story 83. My manager quit, and instead of considering me for the role or making a good hiring decision, my firm decided to employ someone completely unsuitable. I explained in my resignation letter that her hiring was the only reason I decided to quit. I also detailed how she was incapable of performing the role she was hired for and would fail. Story 84. I developed inflammatory tendinitis from hauling large amounts of donations daily at the Salvation Army. It became too much, so I went to the doctor. He advised me not to work for 2 weeks, not even modified duty, to allow for complete rest. I applied for workers' compensation for that period, but my claim was denied because I could not provide a specific time and date of injury, as it was a repetitive stress injury rather than a single event. Workers' compensation sided with the employer due to this technicality. After quitting, I learned that a similar situation had occurred a few years earlier at another store, where they used the same reason to deny payment for a month's absence. There were many reasons I chose to quit, including unpaid holiday time, being forced to work more than 20 days straight, closing at 10 p.m. and opening at 8 a.m., threats of termination for refusing to perform dangerous tasks such as jumping on dumpsters filled with broken glass and furniture, demands to clean up human waste, and numerous other unacceptable conditions. It was a terrible organization, the only job I have ever quit in my life. Story 85. I started the job in 2017, after almost a year of negotiations. It was an architectural firm with 5 to 6 employees when I joined, more than 20 when I left. I worked from home, reported directly to the chief executive officer, and earned enough to buy a 3-bedroom apartment in cash every 5 to 6 years. I was paid 4 to 5 times as much as the next best paid person in the company, but I was well worth it. When we were making portfolios for initial meetings with potential clients, 20 out of 25 of the buildings in the portfolio were my projects. I single-handedly completed about 50 to 60% of the company's projects, and even today, almost 5 years after I left, about 40% of the projects on the webpage are mine, closer to 60 to 70% by square footage. So why did I leave? At some point, my boss started getting a bit obnoxious. It started with small things like crashing coordination meetings with our subcontractors, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, electrical, plumbing, and so on. He would take charge of the conversation despite knowing very little about the project, go off on unrelated tangents, interrupt me whenever I tried to get things back on track, waste everyone's time, and send me text messages during meetings saying, "Oh my God, why are you not talking? Thank God I'm here, or this meeting would have been a complete disaster." Then, at client meetings, the client, noticing how little my boss knew about the details of the project, would jokingly ask, "Which one of you is designing the building?" And my boss would always answer, "Oh, I designed the building, of course. My username is just here to draft the blueprints," which was far from the truth. Eventually, the situation escalated. I would receive angry messages from my boss about things like me or our subcontractors not being able to fulfill unrealistic promises she made to clients, about other people messing up on their projects I often had to fix, and about things going wrong because of poor management. The final straw was a project for a large client with a big piece of land who wanted to develop it. I was unable to attend the meeting in person, so it took me 2 to 3 workdays to get the project parameters, what exactly the client wanted, from my boss and 2 junior employees who attended. None of them were in the room for the entire meeting and all had different recollections. After working on the project for several months, traveling across the country every week to meet the client, and nearly crashing my car after falling asleep at the wheel on a 700-kilometer road trip with only 1 hour of sleep, it turned out I had designed the main access road coming from the west. My boss, who had seen the project many times by then, suddenly wanted the road to come from the south because permits would be obtained about a month faster that way. At 11 p.m., I started receiving angry messages. At 1 a.m., I stopped arguing and turned off my phone. At 2 a.m., I sent an email redesigning the road network so the main access road could come from the south without altering any of the finished buildings. At 3 a.m., my company-paid computer was disconnected. My hard drives were removed, and I sent a message saying, "Enough. I'm leaving on the 31st. Story 86. Coworkers scratching my car. Poor management. Drug tests for being tired. Long hours. Only 1 day off per week." I could continue, but this summarizes it. Story 87. Burnout. You know how they say time is money? For me, acquiring any amount of money beyond poverty made it so I no longer had time. I have been out of work for about 8 months now. I could barely take a day off when I was sick. I am never working myself to death like that again. No regrets. Story 88. The final straw was when my supervisor kept accidentally scheduling team meetings during my lunch break. I found out he only did this to the female employees. 3 months into my new job, and my mental health has improved drastically. Story 89. I got tired of working 84 hours a week. I went 3 months with no days off, received a paid salary with no overtime, worked while I had the flu, and ended up losing 30 pounds. Story 90. People around me were doing travel nursing with 3 years less experience and were making triple my pay. I left for travel nursing and paid off all my debt. I moved between jobs and made more than I had ever made as a staff nurse. I rejoined staff as a float pool nurse, making as much or more than travel nurses. My boss will not respond to me about getting off night shift after being on it for 2 years, because they really need help on nights, and I am about to finish my 2-year contract. I am going to leave and go back to travel nursing soon, so now they will be short nights and evenings. Nursing management can be very frustrating. Story 91. It was more like a slow burn. At first, it was little things like feeling drained even before I started work. Then it got to the point where I would stare at the screen and think, is this what I am going to be doing for the next 10 years? The atmosphere at work did not help either. People were either miserable or pretending not to be. And do not even get me started on the micromanaging. I could not even breathe without someone needing a quick update. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.